I think we can all agree that to be selected to the All-Star game, you need to be, well, good. Historically, the whole idea of the All-Star game is that the top performing players in baseball play each other to determine which league is better, the National League or the American League. You want the best players around to make up the roster to give each side the best chance to win. Seems obvious. Most of the time, this does occur, and ballot stuffing incidents aside, the point is, you won't see poor performing players on the roster for the Midsummer Classic. Sometimes, there will be snubs, where one player gets added over a more deserving player, and that often occurs because every team needs at least one player to represent them on the roster. This is bound to happen, but typically isn't outrageous. I'm sure people are about to comment on what their favorite snub was from the game a few days ago, but it's not as if a player batting 150 is getting selected over the MVP favorite. However, with all rules, there are exceptions, and we've seen a fair share of players selected to the All-Star game who, in layman's terms, had no business being there. In a famous example, relief pitcher Mike Williams of the 2003 Pittsburgh Pirates was selected to the All-Star game despite the fact that, at the time, he had an ERA of 6.44. I don't think I need to explain why an ERA that high is not All-Star worthy. Why was Williams chosen in the first place? It goes back to the rule that every team needs at least one player selected to the All-Star roster, and the Pirates simply needed someone to represent them. Pittsburgh that season had a losing record, and had only so many players that could be a fit for the All-Star game. Why Williams was chosen over outfielder Brian Giles, a player who had an OPS over 950 at the time, I have no idea. My guess is the only position left was for a reliever, so it had to be someone from the bullpen. Williams was the only Pirate to be selected, so that does make some sense. Despite the atrocious ERA, I wouldn't say Mike Williams was the worst player ever selected to an All-Star game. Who was then? The worst player ever to be selected to the All-Star game was Alfredo Griffin in 1984. First off, who is this player? Alfredo Griffin was a shortstop who played in Major League Baseball for 18 seasons from 1976 to 1993. He played for 4 teams, but spent the most time with the Toronto Blue Jays. In his long career, Griffin has over 7,300 plate appearances where he slashed .249 with a .285 on base and .319 slugging for a .604 OPS, 67 adjusted OPS, and earned 3.1 WAR. Yes, that WAR amount is correct. His hitting stats may be underwhelming, but you don't play 18 seasons in the big leagues by accident. Griffin was a terrific defender who won a Gold Glove award and even won the 1979 Rookie of the Year award. During those 18 years, he also made the All-Star game once. The unusual thing about that selection is that Alfredo Griffin was not only the worst player ever to be selected to the All-Star game, it's by far the weirdest All-Star game selection of all time. Just how bad was Griffin that season? He slashed .241 with a .248 on base and .298 slugging for 546 OPS, 48 adjusted OPS, and earned negative 1.5 WAR. He hit only 4 home runs and stole just 11 bases, so he wasn't a threat with the bat or as a base stealer. Perhaps the most egregious stat of this season was the fact that Alfredo Griffin walked a grand total of 4 times. 4 walks in 442 plate appearances. In the live ball era, Griffin's 4 walks are the fewest ever by someone with that many plate appearances in a single season. If we look at all of MLB history, Griffin has the 3rd fewest, where we need to go back to 1909 to find someone with a lower amount. Anyway, in its near century-long history, Griffin's negative 1.5 WAR is the 2nd lowest amount for a position player to be selected to the All-Star game, only beaten by Reggie Jackson of the 1983 California Angels. Now, some of you may be thinking, those were Griffin's total stats for the season. Was he performing better entering the All-Star game? At the time of the game, Griffin had 262 plate appearances and slashed .241 with a .250 on base and .317 slugging for a 567 OPS. I should note that the average American League OPS in 1984 was 724. It's also not as if Griffin had excelled at a specific offensive category. At the time, he had 4 home runs, 10 extra base hits, 6 stolen bases, 19 RBIs, you get the idea. I'm also sure many might be thinking, yes, it was bad, but what about the other 2 players mentioned? Why weren't they a worse selection? Mike Williams might have had an ERA over 6, But he did have 25 saves, which was the 4th highest in all of Major League Baseball, so at least he had something going for him. Reggie Jackson was actually playing well when he was selected. Entering the 1983 All-Star Game, Jackson had an OPS of 722. However, thanks in part to an injury, he slumped down the stretch and finished the season with an OPS of 630. While overall Jackson had a terrible season, we can still see why he deserved to make the All-Star team. Alfredo Griffin was bad from start to finish, with no redeeming qualities whatsoever. To this day, he's the worst player ever to make an All-Star team, but that raises an interesting question. Given everything I just said, why was Griffin selected to the All-Star game in the first place? The Blue Jays had 2 other All-Stars in Dave Stieb and Damaso Garcia, so it's not as if they needed Griffin to represent them. As it turns out, Griffin was a part of the roster by complete accident. As explained in the Washington Post newspaper, Major League Baseball expends All-Star Game electees to bring a guest to accompany them. Most players will bring a wife or girlfriend, but Damaso Garcia's wife was out of town and couldn't go with him. By sheer coincidence, Griffin's wife was also out of town during those few days. Griffin was quoted saying, "It's crazy. My wife was out of town and his wife was out of town and he could bring a guest, so Damaso said, why not come out to see the game?" Additionally, as luck would have it, the All-Star game that season was being played at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. The Blue Jays were set to play in nearby Oakland after the All-Star break, so naturally, it also made sense for Griffin to go for convenience sake. While Griffin initially was only attending to cheer on the team, there was a quick turn of events. Reserve shortstop Alan Trammell had suffered an arm injury and was unable to play in the game. He suffered the injury on July 8th, but didn't realize he was too hurt to play until a day later on July 9th. The All-Star game was occurring on July 10th, so this all went down just one day before the game. In need of a shortstop on a moment's notice, manager Joe Altobelli caught word about Griffin being present and named him to the roster. Reportedly, Altobelli added Griffin to the roster, partly because he's a fine player, but mostly because he was here. On the issue, Griffin was quoted saying, "Maybe I should not be here, but if I play, I will try hard to show they did not make a mistake." With the sudden notice, one source mentions how Griffin had to wear Garcia's backup uniform while his was being mailed overnight. Another source mentions that since Griffin was now on the roster, it triggered a clause in his contract where he earned a bonus, speculating it to be at least $25,000. Imagine going on a paid vacation with a friend and learning you'd also earn $25,000. Not a bad week for the shortstop. The big question is, did Griffin even appear in the All-Star game? Yes, he did. In the bottom of the 6th inning, Griffin came in to replace Cal Ripken Jr. as a defensive replacement. Damaso Garcia was also in the game at second base, and the two even made an out together when Ozzie Smith grounded to Griffin to get the force out. He wouldn't get an at-bat, however, as Don Mattingly came in to pinch it for him in the 9th inning. Alfredo Griffin spent nearly 20 years in Major League Baseball, and his only All-Star Game appearance came in the most unconventional way. All it took was for his wife to be busy, another player's wife to be busy, and an injury to another player to force him into the game. The worst player to play in the All-Star Game came from the weirdest All-Star Game selection of all time, and it stems from the epitome of being in the right place at the right time.